I pull my nets at 4:30 in the morning, not because the fish demand it, though they have their preferences, but because 4:30 is the hour when the harbor at Gloucester is still, and the light has not yet decided what it is going to be, and the water holds a quality of possibility that it loses by 6 when the pleasure boats start their engines and the day declares itself. I have been pulling nets at 4:30 for 23 years. I know this harbor the way I know my own hands, which is to say imperfectly, but reliably, which is to say well enough to navigate it in the dark without thinking, which is exactly what I do every morning while I am thinking about other things. The morning this story turns on, I was thinking about my son Daniel. I am always thinking about Daniel in the early hours. The early hours are when the thinking has the least interference, when the mind settles to its actual concerns without the noise of the day pushing them around. Daniel has been gone for 9 years. He was 17 years old. A swimming accident on the Cape in August, the kind that happens in a second and cannot be undone, cannot be reasoned with, cannot be addressed by any of the resources or intelligence or determination that a person brings to every other problem they have ever faced. He was gone. I was 41 years old, and the man I had been for 41 years stopped existing in the space of a phone call, and what was left went to the harbor at 4:30 the next morning, because the harbor was the only place I knew how to be when I did not know how to be anywhere. I have been going back every morning since, not to grieve exactly, not anymore, to remember, and to do the only work I know that asks of me exactly what I have to give, which is my hands and my attention and my willingness to wait for what the water decides to bring up. If you have ever lost someone and found that the only way to keep carrying was to keep showing up to the place where the carrying made sense, this channel is for you. Subscribe right now, because every story here is for the people who have found their way to the other side of an impossible loss and discovered that what they built in the years of surviving it turned out to be exactly what someone else needed. My name is Martin Cole. I am 50 years old. I fish out of Gloucester, Massachusetts, on a 34-foot vessel called the Daniel Rose, which I named after my son because every time I put her in the water I want to say his name in a way that does not require me to explain why. And naming the boat was the way I found to do that. I am a single father, or I was. My daughter Rosie is 24 years old, lives in Boston, teaches elementary school, which she chose because she said she wanted to be in rooms with children who were still figuring out who they were. And which I understand completely, because I have spent 9 years in a harbor trying to figure out who I am without a piece of me that I had always assumed would be there. Rosie's mother and I separated when Rosie was 6. The separation was not about Daniel, who was not yet born then, but about two people who had stopped being able to hear each other, which is the most common and least dramatic reason separations happen, and which I say without any particular grief, because the separation, painful as it was, gave me the years with Daniel and Rosie that I would not trade for anything on earth. After the separation it was me and Rosie and eventually Daniel, and then just me and Rosie, and then just me, and each of those configurations shaped me in ways I am still discovering the edges of. I want to tell you about Daniel before I tell you about the boy in this story, because this story cannot be understood without Daniel, and Daniel deserves to be known as more than a loss. He was 17 years old, which means he had been a person for 17 years before the August morning that took him, and those 17 years produced a human being whose outline I am still tracing in everything I do. Daniel was funny. I mean genuinely funny, the kind of funny that is not performance but observation, that finds the thing in a situation that is simultaneously true and absurd and names it before anyone else has noticed it is there. He was the kind of person who could make a room feel more like itself by being in it, which is the rarest social gift and the one I have missed most in the 9 years since. Because every room I walk into now has a small absence in it, where that gift used to be. He was also, and this is the thing I think about most when I am on the water at 4:30, extraordinarily patient for a 17-year-old. Patient in the specific way of someone who has spent a great deal of time around a person who cannot be hurried, which in Daniel's case was me. I am a slow processor. I think things through at the pace the water sets, which is to say at whatever pace the current decides, and Daniel had grown up watching me do this, and had absorbed it the way children absorb the habits of the parent they spend the most time with. Which for Daniel was me, in a boat, waiting for what the water brought up. He was patient on the water in the way I was patient on the water. He had learned it from me, and I had learned it from the water, and the chain of transmission is, when I think about it, the thing that makes the most sense about my life. What I know about waiting I learned from 30 years of fishing. What Daniel knew about waiting he learned from me. And what the boy in this story learned about waiting he learned from neither of us directly, but from the consequence of Daniel's patience living in me long after Daniel was gone, because this story cannot be understood without Daniel. And Daniel deserves to be known as more than a loss. He was 17 years old, which means he had been a person for 17 years before the August morning that took him, and those 17 years produced a human being whose outline I am still tracing in everything I do. Daniel was funny. I mean genuinely funny. The kind of funny that is not performance but observation, that finds the thing in a situation that is simultaneously true and absurd and names it before anyone else has noticed it is there. He was also, and this is the thing I think about most when I am on the water at 4:30, extraordinarily patient for a 17-year-old. Patient in the specific way of someone who has spent a great deal of time around a person who cannot be hurried, which in Daniel's case was me. I am a slow processor. I think things through at the pace the water sets, which is to say at whatever pace the current decides, and Daniel had grown up watching me do this, and had absorbed it the way children absorb the habits of the parent they spend the most time with. Which for Daniel was me, in a boat, waiting for what the water brought up. He was patient on the water in the way I was patient on the water. He had learned it from me, and I had learned it from the water, and the chain of transmission is, when I think about it, the thing that makes the most sense about my life. What I know about waiting I learned from 30 years of fishing. What Daniel knew about waiting he learned from me, and what the boy in this story learned about waiting he learned from neither of us directly, but from the consequence of Daniel's patience living in me long after Daniel was gone. The harbor at Gloucester in the early morning is not a place that most people who do not fish understand correctly. They imagine it picturesque, which it is from the outside, from the tourist photographs and the historical paintings and the way it looks in the golden hour when the light is being cooperative. What it actually is, in the hours before all of that, is industrial and cold and honest in the specific way that places are honest when nobody is performing for an audience. The boats smell like what they do. The water smells like what is in it. The men who work it are tired in the straightforward way of people who have been up since 3 and have not yet had enough coffee to pretend otherwise. It is a working place. The prettiness of it is a byproduct of the function, not the point. I have always found this preferable. I want to tell you something about what 23 years of early mornings in a harbor does to a person, because it is relevant to everything that follows, and most people who have not experienced it cannot quite imagine it. 23 years of 4:30 means 23 years of the specific quality of consciousness that exists before the day has fully woken up, when the mind is operating below its usual noise level. When the thoughts that have been waiting their turn all week finally get to the front of the line. I do not plan what I think about on the water. The water sets the agenda. And the water's agenda, for 23 years, has included Daniel in a way that has changed over time without ever diminishing. In the first years after he died, I went to the harbor, because I could not be in the apartment and the harbor was the only other place I knew. In the middle years I went, because the going had become a practice, and the practice had become the structure of my mornings, and the structure of my mornings had become the structure of what remained of my life. Now I go because I know why I go, which is to be in the place where Daniel's absence is most specifically and most honestly felt, which is also the place where it is most specifically and most honestly carried, which is the same place, which is the point. They imagine it picturesque, which it is, from the outside, from the tourist photographs and the historical paintings, and the way it looks in the golden hour, when the light is being cooperative. What it actually is, in the hours before all of that, is industrial and cold and honest in the specific way that places are honest when nobody is performing for an audience. The boats smell like what they do. The water smells like what is in it. The men who work it are tired in the straightforward way of people who have been up since 3 and have not yet had enough coffee to pretend otherwise. It is a working place. The prettiness of it is a byproduct of the function, not the point. I have always found this preferable. The harbor does not try to be anything. It is what it is, and it does what it does, and if you are willing to meet it where it is, it will give you what it has. That is as honest a relationship as I have ever had with anything that is not a person, and in the years since Daniel, it has been enough to get me out of bed at 3:30 when nothing else has been. The woman's name is Constance Merrill. She is 44 years old. She runs a biotechnology company out of Cambridge that has produced, by what I have absorbed from the general circulation of impressive facts about impressive people in a harbor town that attracts both working people and wealthy summer residents, several patents and evaluation that gets discussed in the kind of publications I do not read, but that my daughter tells me about. She started coming to the harbor in late June, which is when the summer people begin arriving. I noticed her the way I notice anything that is new in a familiar place, which is immediately and without particular interest, a new variable in a known environment. She was there every morning at 6 when I was coming in. Always on the same bench at the far end of the dock, away from where the boats tie up, looking at the water with the expression of someone who has brought a problem to the one place she hoped it might become more manageable. She had a boy with her. Every morning, the same boy. 8 years old, compact, with the specific stillness of a child who has decided that stillness is safer than movement. He sat beside her on the bench and he looked at the water, and he did not speak. Not to her. Not to anyone. I know this because I am on the dock every morning for 2 hours before I go home, cleaning and repairing and doing the maintenance that a working boat requires daily. And the dock in the early morning has a particular quality of quiet that carries everything in it. A voice from 50 feet away is audible if you are paying attention. In 6 weeks of watching this woman and her son on the bench at the end of the dock, I heard her speak to him many times, and I heard him say nothing. Not once. Not a word. Not even the small sounds that children make when they are not speaking but are still communicating. The and the and the sounds that mean I am here and I am listening. Nothing. Just the boy on the bench looking at the water with his hands in his lap and his face arranged in the careful stillness of someone who has withdrawn to a place inside himself that he is not yet ready to leave. I learned Constance's story the way I learn most things about the harbor's summer residents. In pieces and from the edges of conversations, and from the particular evidence that a person's behavior offers to anyone who has spent enough time paying attention to behavior. A harbor in summer is a place where the line between the working world and the visiting world is thin and permeable, where the lobsterman and the biotech CEO are using the same dock for different purposes and occasionally. In the early morning before either of them has had to perform anything for anyone, are simply 2 people sitting with the same water. I did not introduce myself to Constance. She did not introduce herself to me. We occupied the same dock for 6 weeks in the specific parallel solitude that early mornings make possible, where you are aware of another person's presence without being in any kind of social contract with it. I watched them from my end of the dock the way I watch everything at that hour, without agenda, registering what I registered, and letting it settle into the part of my mind that processes things at the water's pace. About the harbor's summer residents, in pieces and from the edges of conversations, and from the particular evidence that a person's behavior offers to anyone who has spent enough time paying attention to behavior. What I learned was this. The boy's name was Owen. He was 8 years old. His father, Constance's husband, had died 14 months ago. A sudden death, the specific kind I understood too well. the kind that happens before anyone is prepared, and that leaves the living in a particular configuration of shock and absence that nothing in a person's prior life has given them tools for. Owen had stopped speaking 3 weeks after his father died, not immediately, as if he had tried, for 3 weeks, to find a way to talk about the thing that had happened and had not been able to find one, and had decided, at the end of those 3 weeks, that silence was the more honest response to a world that had stopped making the kind of sense that language requires in order to function. This is my interpretation. Owen could not have told me this himself. But I have spent 9 years making peace with a loss that had no adequate language either, and I recognized in the way he sat on that bench the posture of someone who has arrived at the same conclusion I arrived at, which is that some things are too large for words and need to be sat with quietly until they are small enough to name. I want to tell you about Owen before I tell you about the bottle, because Owen deserves to be understood as more than a boy who stopped speaking. He was 8 years old, which means he had been a person for 8 years before his father died, and those 8 years had produced someone specific. I gathered this from the evidence available to a person who observes from a dock, without being invited into anyone's life, which is to say from the quality of his attention and the way he sat, and the particular things he chose to look at in the harbor on the mornings he was there. Owen was the kind of child who looked at one thing at a time with complete attention, rather than scanning a scene the way most children scan, which is to say he was the kind of child who had already developed, at 8, the capacity to be fully present in a single thing. He looked at the water the way I look at the water, which is to say as if it has something to say, and the looking is how you receive it. Whether this was something he had before his father died, or something the grief had shaped in him, I could not know, but I recognized it. And I recognized in Constance the expression of a mother who loves this quality in her child, and is also watching it become something that is separating him from the world around him, and who does not know how to honor both of those truths simultaneously. Constance had, by the time she started coming to the harbor, tried everything that 14 months of considerable resources and considerable love could produce. Therapists, grief counselors, child psychiatrists, a specialist from Boston Children's who worked specifically with traumatic childhood mutism. Owen sat in every session with the polite cooperative stillness of a child who is not refusing to engage, but who has nothing to offer, no words available, no access to the register of language that the sessions required. He attended school. He did his work. He communicated in writing when writing was required and through gesture and expression when it was not, but he did not speak. And the harbor was where Constance brought him in the mornings before school, because it was the one place, she told me later, where the silence felt appropriate rather than alarming, where nobody expected him to produce anything, where the water was simply there, and he was simply there, and nothing was required of either of them. I want to tell you something about what 9 years of carrying a loss teaches you about other people who are carrying losses, because this is the thing that made the difference, and I want to name it clearly. It teaches you to recognize the posture. Every person who is carrying something very heavy develops a specific way of holding themselves, a specific relationship between their body and the space around them, that is different from the way a person holds themselves when they are not carrying anything. It is not always visible to someone who has not learned to look for it. But to someone who has spent 9 years wearing their own version of it, it is as recognizable as a familiar face. Owen had it. Constance had it. I had it. We were 3 people on a dock in the early morning, all carrying something too heavy to put down, and the recognition of that fact, even wordless, even from 50 feet away across a working harbor, was a kind of company that none of the official resources had been able to manufacture for Owen, because official resources are not designed to provide the company of a shared weight. They are designed to reduce the weight. And Owen was not ready for his weight to be reduced. He was still learning its dimensions. He was still learning to carry it. What he needed was not someone to take it from him, but someone to sit beside him who was carrying their own and had not been destroyed by it. That was what the harbor mornings were doing for Constance. She was looking for evidence that a person could carry this. She brought Owen to see the same evidence. And I was, without intending to be, the evidence. I did not approach them for the first 4 weeks. This is important, and I want to be clear about it. I am not a man who involves himself in other people's business, particularly at the harbor, where the culture is one of leaving people to their own relationship with the water and the morning. I noticed them. I registered what I noticed. I did not act on it. The thing that changed was not a plan. It was a net. Specifically, it was the morning in the 5th week when I pulled up a net that had been down for 20 hours and found, tangled in it alongside the expected catch, a small glass bottle with a cork in it. Old glass, the kind that has been in the water long enough to acquire the particular opacity that sea glass gets, smooth at the edges, the color shifted toward green-gray. Inside the bottle, visible through the clouded glass, was a rolled piece of paper. This is not as unusual as it might sound to someone who does not fish. The ocean produces unusual things. I have pulled up stranger. But this particular bottle, on this particular morning, with the boy on the bench at the end of the dock looking at the water, struck me as something I was supposed to do something with rather than discard. I do not know why. I am not a superstitious man. I am a practical man who spends a great deal of time at the intersection of patience and the unpredictable, which is another way of describing a fisherman's life. And sometimes at that intersection things arrive that require you to respond to them rather than interpret them. The bottle was one of those things. I cleaned the bottle. I dried it. I walked to the end of the dock where the bench was, which is something I had not done in 5 weeks of watching. I sat down on the dock beside the bench, not on the bench, below their eye level, because sitting below someone's eye level is a way of being present that does not demand to be looked at directly. I did not speak to Constance. I did not introduce myself. I set the bottle on the dock in front of the boy. He looked at it. His mother looked at me. I said to her quietly, "I pulled it up this morning. I thought he might want to see it." She looked at the bottle. She looked at me. She nodded. I sat. We all sat. The morning did its thing around us, boats and light, and the particular sounds of a working harbor coming to the end of its early shift. And then, after about 4 minutes of all of us sitting there with the bottle between us, Owen reached out and picked it up. He turned it in his hands. He held it up to the light that was coming in off the water. He could see the paper inside. He looked at it for a long time, and then he looked at me. Not at his mother, at me. And he said, in a voice that was barely there but was entirely there, "Is there a message in it?" I said, "I think so. Do you want to open it?" He looked at the bottle. He looked at me. He nodded. "I want to tell you what happened in the next 10 minutes, because the 10 minutes are the whole story, and I want to get them right." I had a knife on my belt, the small folding knife I use for line work, and I used it to work the cork out of the bottle, which took about 2 minutes because the cork had swollen from the water. Owen watched the whole operation with complete attention, not the managed stillness of the bench, but actual absorption, the attention of a child who is inside something rather than observing it from a distance. When the cork came free, I handed the bottle to him. He shook the paper out into his palm. It was old paper, not as old as the bottle suggested, but old enough that the edges were soft and the writing on it had faded to barely legible. He unrolled it carefully. He looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "I can't read it." I said, "Let me see." He held it out. The writing was in a script that had faded badly, but I could make out 3 words in the middle of the text. "Gone, but here." I told him what I could read. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What does that mean?" I thought about Daniel. I thought about what I would say to Daniel if I could say anything, and what Daniel would understand about the harbor, and the mornings, and the 9 years of 4:30, and the boat with his name on it. I said, "I think it means the person who wrote it wanted someone to know that even after something is gone, some part of it is still here." Owen held the paper very carefully. He looked at it. Then he said, "My dad is gone." I said, "I know. My son is gone too." He looked at me for the first time directly, the full weight of his attention, The look of a child who has just heard something he needed to hear from someone who had standing to say it. He said, "Do you still miss him?" I said, "Every morning at 4:30. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I miss my dad in the morning too." That was all. That was enough. Constance made a sound beside us that was not a word. She put her hand over her mouth. Owen looked at the bottle in his hand. He looked at the paper. He said, "Can I keep it?" I said, "It's yours. It came out of my net, but it was looking for you. I want to tell you what happened on the dock after Owen said I miss my dad in the morning too, because what happened is the quietest resolution I have ever been part of, and I think quiet resolutions deserve to be described as carefully as dramatic ones. What happened was nothing and everything. Owen held the bottle. He held the paper. He looked at the water. He looked at his mother beside him on the bench, who was very still, and had her hand pressed flat against her leg in the way of someone keeping their own response contained, so as not to interrupt his. He looked at me. And then, after a long moment, he did something I had not seen him do on any of the mornings I had watched from the dock, which is to say he sighed, not with distress. With the particular quality of a sigh, that is a body releasing something it has been holding. The exhale that happens when a tension you have been sustaining finally finds somewhere to go. He sighed, and his shoulders came down a centimeter, and he looked at the water, and he did not say anything else, and he did not need to. We sat for another 20 minutes. Constance eventually asked if he was ready for school. He nodded. He stood up. He held the bottle carefully in both hands. He looked at me one more time before they left, and he said, "Thank you for the bottle." I said, "Thank you for finding it with me." He nodded. He walked off the dock beside his mother, and I watched them go, and I thought about Daniel. About the morning after he died, when I sat in this same harbor at 4:30, and had nothing, and the water was simply there, and did not require me to be anything in particular. I thought about what it had taken, and what it had given, and what it had made me into over 9 years of mornings, and how none of that had seemed like preparation for anything except getting through the next morning, and how the next morning had finally, on a day I had not marked on any calendar, produced a boy with a bottle and a paper and a question I had the exact right answer for, because I had been living inside the question for 9 years. Constance called the harbor master's office 2 days later, trying to find my contact information. It took her another 2 days to reach me, because I am not a person who maintains a consistent relationship with my phone. When she did reach me, she said she needed to tell me something. She said Owen had spoken at dinner the night after the bottle. Not a full conversation. But he had told Rosie, who was visiting that weekend, about the fisherman and the bottle, and the paper that said "gone but here." He had told it in full sentences. He had used his father's name. It was the first time in 14 months he had used his father's name out loud. She said she wanted to thank me. She said she wanted to pay me. I told her there was nothing to pay. She said there had to be. The $1 million was not a serious offer, she said. She knew that. It had been the desperation talking. But she wanted to do something real. I told her the truth. I told her that what had happened on the dock was not something I had done. It was something the water had done. I had been fishing that harbor for 23 years, and in 23 years I had pulled up a bottle with a message in it exactly once, on the morning when a boy who had stopped speaking was sitting at the end of the dock looking at the water. I am not a superstitious man, but I am a man who has spent 23 years learning that the water gives what it gives when it gives it, and that the most useful thing a fisherman can do is be ready to receive it. I was ready. Owen was ready. The bottle came up. That is all that happened. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "What did it actually say on the paper?" I told her the 3 words I had been able to read. "Gone but here." She said, "That is what I have been trying to tell him for 14 months and could not find the way to say." I said, "Sometimes the water finds the way." She laughed. The kind of laugh that is also something else. I drove home. I called Rosie. I told her the story. She was quiet in the way she gets quiet when something is landing in her. Then she said, "Dad, Daniel would have loved that." I said, "I know he would have." She said, "The Daniel Rose pulled up a message for a boy who needed one." I said, something like that. She said that. I said, yes. She said, I love you. I said, I love you too. I went to bed at 9:30 because 4:30 comes early. I was on the water before the light decided what it was going to be. The way I always am, doing the only work I know that asks of me exactly what I have to give. The net went down. The net came up. The harbor was what it always is. And Daniel's name was on the boat, and the morning was his the way every morning is his, which is to say entirely and without explanation and enough. Before you go, I want to ask you one thing. Not a complicated question. Just this. Is there something in your loss that has quietly become a skill? Something you built in the years of surviving, something you never wanted to survive? That has made you into the specific kind of person who could sit at the end of a dock with a bottle and a boy and say exactly the right thing, because you have already lived the question he is asking. I am not asking you to be grateful for the loss. I am asking you to look at what the loss made. You may be surprised by what is there. Tell me in the comments. Tell me about your loss and what it built in you. I read every single one, and I would be honored to know. Hit subscribe if you have not yet. Leave a like so this reaches the person who needs it tonight, and I will see you in the next one.